So tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. A very big welcome to this long-awaited Zoom session with Dr. Brian Broom. We're really glad that you could all join us and are joining us at this moment tonight. I think that you're coming from all over the country, and some of you are from the Mind Body Network, and some of you are from NZCIS, so we're really glad to have you all. I'm Nicola Hogarth-Cregan, a co-director of New Zealand Christians in Science and a chaplain at Maclaurin Chapel. Co-hosting is Andrew Saunders. Can you wave, Andrew, who is also involved with NZCIS and the chapel. And Dr. Graham Finley, the other co-director, is also here tonight as well. This lecture is sponsored by Maclaurin Chapel and the New Zealand Christians in Science, and it's lecture number 2 in the Finding Meaning Post-Pandemic series. And this lecture is meant to be of broad general interest, but also intersecting with the problems of science and faith. So we acknowledge, of course, that the pandemic has utterly pragmatic and mundane causes and meanings at one level of explanation. We don't for one moment doubt any of the science, but all history and all events, and Dr. Broom would argue, at least some diseases, also have other meanings and signification at the intersection of culture, history, biology, politics, religion, as well as individual meaning. So we're in the early days of this pandemic's reach, but there is nevertheless much to be gleaned and learned from its course. And in tonight's lecture, Dr. Broom tackles this question directly. I just want to give advanced notice that we have one more lecture in this series, which we hope will be live in Auckland on October the 14th. Hope never dies. And in that lecture, Sarah Beattie looks at finding meaning in the imaginative interface of science and biblical studies, and in a lecture called Wonders in the Heavens. So we hope that those of you who are in Auckland can also join that lecture, and that will be recorded as well. A bit of information about tonight. Brian will speak for about 3/4 of an hour. If at any time during that lecture you have a question, you can write it down in the chat box. Please make sure you are on mute throughout unless we ask you to unmute. Questions will follow the lecture, and you should ask your question in the chat box, and either Andrew or I will read that out. The lecture will be recorded and available on our website, nzcis.org, in the next few days. I'm going to be putting this onto Speaker View for the recording, but if you want to watch it on Speaker View, I think you also have to put it onto your own Speaker View for your own for the duration of the lecture. So let me now please introduce Brian. Dr. Brian Broom has been described as a philosopher-physician. His passion is for the whole person-centered healthcare, and it grew from a dissatisfaction with the ways body, mind, and spirit have been divided and compartmentalized in most aspects of Western culture, including healthcare and spirituality. Unusually, he is both a consultant physician in clinical immunology and a psychotherapist. He has developed a mind and body approach to physical disease that integrates the patient's personal story with standard medical care. During the last 3 decades, his explorations of the nature of healing have prompted him to look in many directions, and he has realized that much healing lies in a context of relations and relationships. His lifelong commitment to Christian spirituality has been deeply influenced by this. In 1987, he set up the Arahura Christian Counseling and Medical Center in Christchurch, and it was there, whilst combining immunology and psychotherapy, he developed his theoretical and practical clinical approaches. He's written 3 books on this matter: Meaningful Disease in 2018, Somatic Illness and the Patient's Other Story in 1997, and Transforming Clinical Practice Using the Mind-Body Approach in 2019. And going on that, we should be expecting another book any moment. In 2006, he initiated the multidisciplinary postgraduate mind-body healthcare diploma and master's program at AUT University in Auckland, where he is still an adjunct professor. He has a large experience in training and supervising clinicians in the whole person-centered approaches, and has taught extensively both nationally and internationally. So as you will see, Brian is doing exactly the kind of deep integrative work we are keen to promote, and we are very privileged to have him give our second winter lecture tonight. So a very big welcome, Brian, and over to you.
Thank you, Nicola. Good evening, everybody. I know you can't answer back, but I'm grateful that you've taken time out to hear me out. The subject, finding meaning in disease, is a big and massive one, and I'm aware that it has a certain amount of controversy in it. I hope that it will at least stimulate thought and may be helpful to some. Over the last 30 years, I've been exploring the relationships between people's stories and their physical disorders or diseases. Our stories are full of meaning. I've seen many diseases apparently triggered by meanings and maintained by meanings. And I've seen that attention to meanings or people's stories can lead to healing, particularly in chronic disorders, and in a way not able to be achieved by standard biomedical methods. So here tonight, I take on the challenging task of weaving patient stories, patient meanings, physical disease generally, and COVID-19 specifically together. To make it manageable, I will follow the romantic principle of Henry Thoreau, the American 19th century writer of Walden fame. He believed that one should only write about what has been lived intensely. In that spirit, then, everything I say will be grounded in my own lived experience of medicine, of psychotherapy, elements of my own spiritual journey, and importantly, my experiences with people with physical disease I have cared for and treated. The world is awash with meanings. It always has been, and it's intensified recently, it seems. My focus will be two particular kinds of meaning. Firstly, the meanings we make in response to disease, and secondly, the meanings that actually lead to the development of disease. They are quite different. One is a reaction and the other is a cause. That's putting it rather simplistically, but they are dimensionally different. Let's start with the meanings we make in response to disease. These are the easier ones for us to grasp. Let me give you an example. During our lockdown level 4, I had the privilege of mentoring Zoom meetings with a very special group of patients with well-recognised but rare immune deficiency diseases. We spent a total of 4 Zoom hours together, and the vast majority of the time was spent addressing this urgent question: what does this mean for me? Understandably, they felt very much near the COVID-19 cliff edge. Now, all of us, in some measure, are experiencing a sense of uncertainty, of risk, of life constraint, which this small group of patients experience every day, COVID or not. Their norm has become our norm, more or less. Our response to the pandemic is also, what does this mean for me? As individuals and as a collective, we are forced to consider with a new intensity what it means to be free, to live, to flourish, to become sick, or to die. These were always present, but COVID brings close to our consciousness the reality that all of our lives we live under the prospect of not living and of dying. Martin Hägglund, the Swedish philosopher, in his thought-provoking book, This Life, Why Mortality Makes Us Free, makes an interesting comment, somewhat provocative book actually. He says this: "My future is not given. The worlds of which I am a part, the projects I sustain and that sustain me, can flourish and change in a dynamic way, but they can also break apart, atrophy, and die. The worlds that open up through my family and friends, the projects that shape my work and political commitments, carry the promise of my life, but also the risk that my life will be shattered or fail to make sense. My life and projects in which I am engaged are finite. To be finite means primarily two things: to be dependent on others and to live in relation to death. My devotion to the ones I love is inseparable from the sense that they cannot be taken for granted. My time with family and friends is precious because we have to make the most of it. Our time together is illuminated by the sense that it will not last forever, and we need to take care of one another because our lives are fragile." COVID-19 brings these things home to us collectively on a grand scale. These are meanings responses to COVID, and are relatively easy to understand. But I now turn to the more challenging issue, meanings that seem to lead to the development of disease. In the current cultural context, one hardly dares say that diseases can actually be caused by meaning. I typically meet the connections of meaning and disease in individual patients, but also in couples and in families. Diseases caused by meaning can be both individual can be an individual or a collective matter, and I will illustrate both kinds. And I'm going to start with a story which seems very individual. It also serves to show how deeply I perceive that meaning penetrates our bodily reality. I will call her Eunice, a 71-year-old woman who had an 18-month history of very severe generalized thickening of the skin. Very obvious. Her skin was tight and thick, and given her age, you would expect it to be able to be tented up by squeezing, but this was not so. She'd had intensive investigation. A firm diagnosis had not been made, but she'd been labelled as connective tissue disease, which is in my area of interest or specialty. She'd been treated with steroids and other potent drugs, but she had not improved, and she was referred to me by her specialist for a second opinion. I began by inquiring about the onset of her skin thickening, and her first remark was, I quote, "I fell over in a supermarket car park," and damaged her face and legs quite badly. I was immediately inclined, I have to confess, to brush this information off. But something made me hesitate, and I inquired further as to the effect on her, and she said she was shattered. Mystified as to the relevance of this, I asked her more about the effect of this event, and over the next 3 or 4 minutes, she said, and I quote, "I went into my shell for a while," close quotes. She said this 3 times. I was struck by this language. She was taken back to her home by a friendly bystander, and I said, "What did you do?" And she said, I quote, "I went inside the 4 walls of my house and closed the door and sat and sat and sat." And in the few weeks following the injury, her skin thickening developed first in the legs and then became more generalized. I sat there wondering what sense to make of it. Her language struck me. Shell, 4 walls. I inquired about aspects of her life, and it turned out that she had enjoyed extraordinarily good health throughout her life, but it seemed that the accident compromised or shattered her sense of herself as perennially invulnerable. Curiously too, she had started to improve by the time I saw her. She said that over the month before she had improved. I inquired of her as to what she felt was the cause of the improvement. She told me a friend had come to her and said that she should get active again. And she felt she improved again as she started to, quotes, "come out of my shell," close quotes. This shell theme seems to be the metaphor that persisted in both her language and her body. The fall appears to shatter this elderly woman. She reacts to this disintegrative experience by constructing a shell around herself, developing thickening of the skin. Thereafter, she does not improve until she dares come out of my shell. I simply encouraged her to continue to be active and resume her previous social contacts. I saw her 3 times. I checked again a year later, both with her and her physician, and they both reported marked clinical improvement, and she had no need of drugs or medication. Now, I have written about many such examples. In short, I'm saying that diseases can be full of meaning, that's the first thing, but I want to add a couple more. Meaning and disease are co-travelers because people are undivided wholes. Bodies, minds, souls, and spirits, those descriptors we have of ourselves, are not in different compartments. They are in the whole. And the third thing is that disease frequently appears when meanings are challenged. In Eunice, it was the fall that signified her aging or impending fragility and mortality. The meaning in this is unique and personal to Eunice. And the disease appears to reflect or represent the meanings of her life in a way that is fairly obvious to any disinterested and open observer. I've called these kinds of meaning-disease connection cases somatic metaphors or symbolic diseases. Diseases that clearly emphasize a close and causal relationship between human subjectivity and human bodies. When I use the word subjectivity, I mean all those things that can't be easily measured, like mind and emotion and meaning and relationship, and so on, and spirit and soul. I have many other such stories. I shall call her Lorraine, a woman in her 50s who was raped by her brother at age 15 and who presents with genital bleeding when she is confronted by aggressive or even just impolite men. I'll call her Catherine, a woman with severe chronic headaches, beginning at the time her father was dying of brain cancer when she was age 12, subsiding after 6 months, and then occurring again when she lost her first boyfriend at age 16 to her best friend, again occurring for about 6 months. And then they started again and became chronic when she got pregnant at 21 to a young fellow who absconded to Australia. I've said her headaches became chronic, and they were also worsened whenever her relations with men became problematic. The stories could keep coming, but all three of these stories had their own unique details and flavour and meanings. Lorraine's and Catherine's stories are both about trust, though Lorraine's focus around loss and Catherine's story focuses around violation. But simply stated, we see physical disease and symptoms and meanings deeply entwined. But for many people, and particularly clinicians, it is preposterous, or at least unacceptable, to suggest physical disease can be triggered, caused, or partly caused, influenced by one's story or meanings. The reasons for this supposed unacceptability are many and complex. And I'm going to illustrate this resistance from two angles, two of many. And with both of these angles, I have intense lived experience. I'm going to call him Bob. Many years ago, my family and I were lunching with Bob, a medical colleague, and his family. The lunch occasion was winding down. He and I had subsided into a corner to share work perspectives. Both of us had unusual work histories. Firstly, Bob was a medical specialist, an altruistic, principled, practical, and somewhat concrete man who, out of a sense of Christian commitment and service, had devoted years of his life to medical work in a developing country. On my part, I was a Christian out of a rather similar background. I'd been an academic clinical immunologist, a practicing physician and medical school teacher who turned to psychiatry in midlife, then became a psychotherapist, and then blended and integrated my clinical immunology and psychotherapy practices together. It was a long sentence. This unusual direction reflected a personal aspiration to integrate body, mind, and spirit aspects of human reality into my clinical and healing endeavours. So back to the post-lunch chat with Bob. I started sharing with him my experiences of people with diverse, well-recognised physical diseases that seemed to be full of meaning and were sometimes even glaringly symbolic. He didn't resist, and I told him of a patient in her early 30s, and I'll call her Susan. She had a very interesting history, a long list of unexplained bone fractures and tendon injuries occurring over 4 years, extensively investigated by a number of specialists, and no answers able to be provided. At the beginning of the 4 years, she had entered a new relationship and came under a number of pressures from her partner to participate with him in his, I would call, I guess, excessive outdoor pursuits. And in particular, he wanted her to run a triathlon with him, or do a triathlon with him. On the other hand, she wanted to start a family, which he strongly opposed. And the injuries had effectively prevented her participation in his activities. This constituted an undiscussed and unresolved relational standoff. The situation intensified, and during the year prior to consultation, she had become an invalid, confined to a wheelchair and unable to work. She had been working with a psychotherapist for that year, but without improvement. In my first session with her, what emerged was both the detail I've already described, but also a powerful and poignant underlying early story, which went as follows. At the age of 6, her parents had split up, and under the care of her father, he proposed adopting her out. It didn't actually happen, but she certainly felt the threat and fear of potential abandonment. A few years later, her father entered a relationship with a woman who had a child of the same age and sex as my patient, Susan. 2 or 3 weeks into this blending of families, the other child fractured her arm, became the focus of family attention, and my patient recalled that she felt she was losing her father. Soon after that, my patient fell off her bicycle and fractured her leg and got her father back, was how she put it. I drew attention to how the feelings, the meanings in the present story of injury echoed in some ways the early story of injury, which in summary went as follows. She was declaring her desire and need to be a mother. She was unconsciously resisting her partner's dominance and possible abandonment of her if she didn't fit into his way of being. She developed musculoskeletal manifestations which effectively disrupted her participation in his activities. And all the while, this all allowing her to avoid direct communication, conflict, and threat to the relationship. But it wasn't working. She still did not achieve her desired motherhood. So I put it somewhat like that, and she was entirely on board with it. So I suggested that she have a session with her, or they have a session with her psychotherapist together, and that they discuss what her injuries had to do with their relationship, their resistances to one another, her fears of loss and abandonment, and the role of injury in maintaining the relationship, and whatever else appeared in the discussion. The injury tendency quickly disappeared, and entirely, once this was acknowledged between them and it was agreed she could become pregnant. I checked with her 3 years later. She had suffered no more injuries from about a month after seeing me and discussing this with her psychotherapist, was a proud mother of one. Her partner still didn't want any more children, and she was participating in his outdoor activities. So here is a story of a physical disorder freighted with the meanings of an individual and a couple. I told this story to Bob. He had lived and worked well outside the norms of Western medical and cultural structures. I imagined that he, being a religious person, might be open to a wider view of disease than that in which we had been trained. He was not. The conversation stopped dead. What are we to make of this? Most people don't expect their doctors to suggest that our Crohn's disease or eczema or asthma or our COVID-19 or any other condition could be tied up with our stories, our social or relational experience, our ways of seeing the world, our meaning-making capacities, our cultural and societal issues, our spirituality. Because, in large part, within the medical world, a physical disease is a physical disease, and meaning-making activities are something else entirely. The problem I'm focusing on in medicine is that we deal with diseases in persons as if our body is separate from our subjectivity, our mind or soul or spiritual relationships and so on. We see the body and its diseases as things to be done to. The body is set apart, privileged, and has become our primary and frequently our entire focus. This medical way of seeing and behaving rests ultimately, and I say ultimately, upon the perspective that the universe is mechanical and meaningless. 2 weeks ago, or a few weeks ago, a medical student told me that she had been in a clinic with a psychiatrist who actually and rather unbelievably said to her that he hated listening to patient stories. She noticed in his office over his shoulder a shelf of books on psychopharmacology. What have we come to? My anger settled a little when she also referred to another psychiatrist whom she admired, who clearly loved listening to patient stories and saw a central role for relationship and healing. These two psychiatrists are clearly poles apart and serve as an example showing that as individuals, each of us constructs a model of the world, a limiting structure of mind and thought, which we can call an enclosure, which more or less enables us to hold things together. Jules Evans, a London philosopher, in his provocative book, The Art of Losing Control, colourfully describes this tendency towards safe enclosures as like dwelling in, and I quote, a rickety old shed in a haunted forest, close quotes. The rickety shed suggests that the worlds we construct personally or collectively may be, and surely are in numerous ways, limited and are potentially inadequate for the job of living and likely to collapse under certain pressures. The haunted forest element suggests a mysterious, numinous, and scary world beyond our usual perspectives, a place we would normally be reluctant to go. So back to Bob and me again. The two enclosures, and dare I say it, rickety sheds common to Bob and myself that appear in my story are Western biomedicine, relevant of course to tonight's topic, and Protestant Christianity, more personal and shared by Bob and myself. I will refer to them separately, but just do keep in mind that I'm not saying that these are the only two enclosures in Western culture. They're two that I understand pretty well. Firstly, Western biomedicine, an enclosure that affects all clinical disciplines, and it has two outstanding features, at least for my purposes. The first is dualism. The concept or notion or the implicit structure of thinking that holds that mind and body are or can be dealt with as separate compartments. And the second is biological or scientific reductionism. The exclusive privileging of quantitative measurement and statistical analysis for establishing truth, a lack of capacity to entertain experience as a crucial aspect of causation, and particularly disease causation, and a gradual decline of healing as a result, as an art or relational form. There are other features, of course, of biomedicine, but those are the two that I think cause the enclosing that I'm referring to. My diseases with stories question or challenge both of these. The second enclosure, which might have impeded my conversation with Bob, is that of Protestant Christianity, which we both had in common. Like Western scientific medicine, and since its birth in the Reformation, it has also had at its heart a desire to grasp the absolute truth of things, though its aims and means of achieving this are rather different to those of biomedicine, of course. As I experienced it, truth for Protestant believers was sought in establishing the historicity of the biblical record and in interpreting the Bible in exactly the right way, thus securing eternal facts. And endless argument, I might say. In both of these enclosures, biomedicine and Protestant Christianity, there has been an accepted striving for exactitude and certainty, a conviction that we have perhaps all the truth we need in our grasp if we achieve this exactitude. I'm not saying either biomedicine or Protestant Christianity are all bad. I'm just saying that these are factors that lead to enclosures. In a way, both enclosures entail a drive towards mastery and control. But why am I emphasizing this? There is a great cost to this drive. What suffers are the softer elements, the relational dynamics and priorities at the center of human experience and reality, the visceral experiences of living and suffering, the arts of healing and other mysteries of life are subordinated to, on the one hand, hard data and on the other, hard dogma. Indeed, they can even be erased from the consciousness or awareness of, in these two instances, the science-focused clinician and the absolute truth-focused believer. In other words, in the obsessive seeking of a certain kind of truth, seeking a well-built rickety shed, there is a critical neglect of other kinds to be found outside the shed in the enchanted forest. And certainly, very little room for meanings in disease and the role of stories in disease. Anyway, back again to Bob, who briskly closed off my stories, which might have pointed towards an uncomfortable revision of his enclosures. A simpler narrative could be that my companion was merely settled and comfortable in his work and did not want his life complicated. Now, we need some kind of enclosure to make life manageable. But the risk is that excessive closing down tends towards a reduction of truth, a devitalization, and worse still, possibly, stark, cold, black and white places that lack heart for anything that might threaten our equilibrium and safety. We see some vivid examples of this around the world. We do tend to construct confined ways of seeing, simplistic answers to complex problems. Rickety sheds, after all, protect us from the bigness of the wider world and cosmos. But such protection entails not stepping outside the shed to see what there might be in the enchanted forest with its diverse pathways, possibilities, and mysteries. Doing so could be unsettling at best and overwhelming at worst. This tendency we have, all of us, to hunker down is more than personal. We do it as couples, families, social and ethnic groups, organisations, cultures and professions. We enclose ourselves in social webs of interdependent vested interests. But under pressure, our rickety sheds can be very vulnerable and collapse. I've shown it in the examples of the onset of individual disease, but we also see it in the collective and currently in COVID. We strive to keep our enclosures intact, and to keep even safer, we tend to resist and suppress elements that might demand deconstruction, rebuilding, or enlargement. We're seeing this on a wide scale, both socially and politically. Not uncommonly, we step from one enclosure to another. It is very hard to keep truly open and retain stability. And so I found these close connections between individual diseases and patient stories I found that they result in disruption of common cultural assumptions. They disrupt the physico-materialist assumptions of Western medicine. They also disrupt the vision that technology in the future will deliver all the medical answers. But they also make it easy for me to see that COVID-19 is not just a virus. It is a global story, or a collection of stories, and a virus. My observations of disease and story early on disturbed me and shook my foundations. What do I do with this? How shall I talk to my patients about this? What does it mean about my training? What will my peers think of this? How will I write my letters to GPs? But there was much more. I found that when I listened to a person's story at the same time as doing the standard diagnostic and treatment things, people, especially those with chronic diseases, seemed to do better. The story, the meanings, became a guide to what I and we, the clinicians with me, needed to focus on. Eventually, I realized something very important. A story is nearly always about relationships. And so the healing focus became a person's need and ability to face themselves, their relationship with others, and the world in general. You see, once you acknowledge a story may be important in an illness, you open a much wider field of healing possibility. Standard treatments and a story emphasis go naturally together when you see that a person is a unity, a whole, and that the body and mind and spirit go naturally together. By analogy, we need a COVID-19 vaccine, the standard treatment. But many of us can see that our cultural, national and global stories are deeply problematic and contributory and need attention. Our typical dualistic biomedical approach, separating body, virus and healthcare from mind, soul, spirit and relationships generally, severely limits our interpretation of what COVID-19 may be saying to us. Put another way, persons are wholes, families are wholes, societies are wholes, the world as a whole. There is no such thing as COVID on its own. Physical disease has physical, story, relational, socio-cultural and spiritual dimensions. I don't really think there is such a thing as a unifactorial illness, though maybe severe genetic problems could be seen that way. Illnesses are mostly multifactorial and multidimensional. The COVID crisis follows the same logic. It has emerged in a slew of factors. Standing back, commentators everywhere are announcing stories. It's the Chinese, the wet markets, it's globalization, it's about good and bad leaders, it's about a team of 5 million, it's about getting a vaccine, it's just about mismanagement, and we need an urgent recovery of the neoliberal market economy. It's a judgment upon the way we have lived and despoiled the world. It's about God or spirit and repentance, a need to find a firm spiritual ground upon which to stand, from which we can live healthy and responsible lives, both individually and collectively. Whatever the individual value or the value of these individual stories, one thing is for certain: we are being challenged as to what it means both individually and collectively. Like a disease in an individual, the pandemic is multifactorial and multidimensional. This is not really new. Think of the slow-burning diabetes and obesity pandemics. They are also multifactorial and multidimensional. Just as an individual with a disease and a matching story has to stop and take stock of the realities triggering and maintaining an illness, so do we as societies need to stop and take stock of the factors triggering and maintaining this pandemic. There have, of course, been innumerable standout events that have dramatically influenced collective meanings. Historians look back at the Great Lisbon earthquake in 1755 as a seminal event having a massive effect on Western intellectual and theological discourse. We have climate change and COVID-19. We need to face the individual and collective stories that have led to climate change, and we need to face the individual and collective stories that are contributing to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I will stop there. Thank you, Nicola. I can't hear you.
Thank you very much, Neil. That was wonderful.
Brian.
And we have a whole lot of questions already, so I will start asking them. Okay. Brian, can you suggest a pathway from loss, violation, etc., to disease or bodily malfunction?
Could you say that again?
This is from someone called Russell. Can you suggest a pathway from loss, violation, etc., to disease or bodily malfunction? I think he's just asking how does it work.
Oh, what the mechanism is.
Yeah. Mm.
I think one of the things too, there are a whole number of things I'd like to say to that. One is that I would say that all stories, story-related diseases, have a biological face to them. So because the body and the mind, or I'm using mind in a wide sense there, body and mind are one, we should expect that if there's a story, that there will be a biological mechanism as well. It would depend on what disease we're talking about. There are a number of things to say there, and being an immunologist, and the usual thing is to trot out a psychoneuroimmunology possibility, or a psychoneuroendocrinoimmunology possibility. And there's a lot of evidence that psychological factors affect the immune system. So there are immune pathways and there are endocrine pathways. But I think the problem, there's another problem in the background here, which is that unless we have a known mechanism, we cannot accept that stories, or many people cannot accept that stories are relevant in disease. So it's a sort of plausibility element to evidence and proof. And that's difficult because we can probably stop or avoid facing the relevance of story and subjectivity in disease until we've got a plausibility mechanism, but we can't study it because mind and body are separate. So it's a circular negativity there. The other thing I would say about that in general response to it is that there have been thousands or many hundreds into the thousands of articles on psychoneuroimmunology showing or providing evidence in both animals and in humans that immune systems are certainly positively and negatively affected by emotional states and psychic arrangements in the individual. I've been to many immunology conferences and over the year international conferences, and I've hardly ever heard a reference to psychoneuroimmunology. It hasn't made the evidence, the research has made no difference to immunology practice, and that's another reflection of the mind-body split in Western medicine.
Okay, I have another question that's very similar. And this one says, the magical bridging word between disciplines could be stress. Most physicians acknowledge its impact.
Yes, they do. I call stress a suitcase word. If you don't open a suitcase, it's useless. I think the stress research around disease is largely a top-down activity. That is, the psychologists decide how to measure stress, and then we apply questionnaires to patients as if they are, all the same, or a group of patients with asthma or ulcerative colitis or whatever, and then we decide whether these measurements or these scales show any difference between controls and so on. And I mustn't lose my point here. Show any difference between those who are stressed and not stressed. The problem with that is that in applying these questionnaires and general categories to patients, what we're doing is erasing their individual stories. And so we're taking a top-down expert view of the reality, whereas my stories are bottom-up. That is, they go to the patient and try and ascertain what was going on around the time. I mean, they may well have been stressed as a category, but what's important in noticing certainly the symbolic disorders and in working with them and healing is their individual story. And every individual is unique. They're not, they can't be treated as a group.
Right, now I have a slightly longer question. If I am following correctly, it doesn't matter what belief system we hold, that is Christianity, spirituality, Buddhism, etc., as long as we have a meaningful life within our daily life, to have a passion for our mind, body, and soul, to keep healthy, as it is a full cycle and all connected. I think that's the question. Do you have a...
Did the question, I wonder if the questioner heard me say that. I didn't, I don't think.
No.
I'm not saying there is no such thing as truth. I'm focusing on persons' meanings and their contributions, or the way those meanings relate to their disease manifestations.
Mm. Yeah, I'm sorry, I might not have presented that one very well. Another one from Anne Moody. Thank you. Love the metaphors of enclosure and the secret garden. You said the medical profession. I would argue some of it sees the body as the most important aspect of our being. I suspect that mental health is not that clear and is inclined to deny that aspect of a person. I suspect that our Christian faith has denied the body, even though we speak of the church as being the body of Christ. How do we hear each other into speech to create a healing environment?
I think medicine is not so interested in bodies as it is in diseases and suffering. So if one moves amongst body therapists, for instance, which are very common in Europe, they tend to be much more tuned into the person as a body. So the body is really important, and I think we've in medicine reduced it to disease or pathological dysfunction, and that's understandable and fair enough, but it's not only that. I think the church, well, I'm not a theologian, but the body has been seen, the body and the spirit have been seen as somewhat separate, whereas I would see them as different dimensions of the same whole, and therefore it's not possible to devalue the body any more than it's possible to devalue the mind or the spirit. They're all part of our important dimensionality. And I think we're given life to live those dimensions as fully as possible. So the body's pretty important.
That sounds good. Now this one might be a little difficult. This is from someone who's left, but she's going to come back and listen to the answer. She said she loved the lecture. I wanted to ask if Brian had a comment about euthanasia in light of the story, meaning, and disease stance.
Well, I'm a bit caught between my different roles here. Well, not caught, but I feel my different roles here. As a physician, I remember having huge problems euthanizing our dog. It seemed to be a huge violation of this dog's life. Admittedly, it was a young dog, and it had become ferocious and dangerous. But I still felt very badly, and I wept for 48 hours. So I find it really difficult to imagine taking a life, and that as a physician, all our impulses are towards protecting life or honouring life. But at the same time, I've seen 3 deaths in the family now, and all of them were fraught. 4 deaths, actually. All of them were fraught in some way, and suffering was not palliated appropriately or adequately. And I can see why it is that, and I myself would want palliation that might hasten my own death if there was no alternative. So I do understand the urge to have some power in this issue. But I think personally that the answer lies in a much better funded and more available palliative service. So I want to own that that's my stance. From a Christian perspective, I think, we're all going to die. Mortal life is mortal, and there are times when I don't and haven't hesitated to encourage further medication. But that's what I would call palliation. I don't feel any strong notion that we should reify one principle of sustaining life, whatever, against another principle to relieve suffering and accept the inevitable. But I've already put where I put myself. I think I've kind of tried to answer that question and probably wandered off the point of the question of it. It is a difficult.
It is a big question to ask, just in passing, so thank you. Another question, I hope you're not wearing out yet, because there's quite a few.
No, I'm fine.
Okay. So somebody says, I understand this part Brian is talking about, yet how does it connect with sickly infants and innocent children? Presumably ones that don't have a story yet.
Yeah. And that applies to animals as well. That kind of relates to the question, or to the point I just made, that there is a built-in decay. Well, that particular question doesn't relate to it, but there is a built-in aging and decay in life. There is an inherent fragility to life. There is in life a capability of not only living creatures or sentient creatures like animals and humans, but also trees and plants that if they're not in favourable environments, they don't flourish and they die. And I guess that was one of the reasons I quoted Martin Hägglund. I think it's a mistake to think, and the next thing is that there are things that happen in which the causation is not all about story. I suppose in emphasizing story, you could call me, you might be tempted to call me a story reductionist. I'm not at all. I think, the story might be 5% factor and the genetic element might be a 95% factor. On the other hand, it might be the other way around. And also, everything's not about intellectual capacity or cognitive story. An infant is conceived in relationship. Its uterine experience is obviously relational. Its infancy is deeply relational, and lots of things can go wrong in that process. That infant will never be able to tell a story about that, except in the way it comes up and echoes later in life, which is another big issue in mind-body terms. So what we're saying, what I'm saying, I mean, animals, if left alone or without the right kind of company, or certain animals, particularly sea mammals, without the right kind of company, will start to decline and die. What we experience relationally, our need for nurture and company and sociality, if you like, or social connection, this is mirrored in the whole ecosystem of the world. And the climate change thing is about, in many ways, about us not understanding how connected we all are and how things decline and fail to flourish because we don't keep up our side of the relational bargain. So that question leads me in many directions.
We could have many notes on this topic, I think. Yeah. Can I just interject a question there? I mean, have you had any cases where the meaning ends up being related to a previous generation that's already died?
I can't think of one directly, immediately. I certainly think that's true. If what we know is that trauma and abuse tend to go down generations, and if you believe in a body and mind or subjectivity unity, then why would you say it doesn't occur in the body, but it does occur in the mind? So, but I can't think offhand of one. No.
Okay, so, we have to perhaps go a bit faster now because there are so many questions. John McClure says, the analysis reminds me of a psychodynamic ones which are being challenged in regard to the reliability of the therapist's interpretation of symptoms. Do you think this criticism may apply to your approach?
I think, of course it can apply. The issue, certainly I have been originally trained in the psychodynamic tradition, and I understand what he's saying. One of the things that is very important about the bottom-up approach as opposed to the top-down approach, which I think he's implying, that the therapist has this school of thought or this school of theory, which you then apply to each and every situation variably, of course, but that's what I would call a top-down approach. A bottom-up approach is where you go into the room or you meet the person and you leave all your tool bag at the door. That is, as far as it's possible, leave your theories at the door and go and listen to the patient. Now, I gave you one or two examples there, say of the girl or the woman with the chronic headaches. The headaches start when her father develops and dies of a brain tumour. They start again when she's abandoned by her boyfriend, and they start again when she's abandoned by the man who made her pregnant. Now, I didn't make those up. That's what she told me. Did she make them up? Well, of course she did. I mean, they're hers. But there are echoes there, and echo, and I tend not to interpret until I've seen that there are echoes. The same was true in the woman with the fractures and tendon injuries. I go listening. I go listening to what they say, and from a psychodynamic perspective, I do take out a longitudinal history to get to hear what they have to say. So I'm very careful in training that people don't jump to conclusions from their hoped for theoretical or favoured position, mostly wanting to be clever, actually. That's an early problem in this area, as it is in all expertise. Okay, I think I better move on.
Okay, this one is from a medical student. What clinically applicable advice would you give to future health practitioners regarding the importance of meaning and the mind-body connection?
How to listen and listen and listen and listen again, and don't mobilize your fix it quickly approach. Doctors are trained to recognize patterns according to certain known categories of diagnosis, and the faster you can do that, the better. So there is a contrast here between the fast activity of diagnosis and the slow activity of listening carefully to what it is the person has to say outside that diagnostic frame. So to be a story-oriented clinician means being able to hold those two frames comfortably and evenly together and efficiently without taking a long time.
We're not going to get through all these questions, I'm afraid, people, but another one from someone who's left. Sorry I have to leave, although my question has not been answered yet. We'll listen to it when I receive the recording. Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to find his question. He says, are you using subconscious techniques like clinical hypnotherapy to treat your patients?
No.
That was quick. That's easy. Somebody's asking, is resignation syndrome not a prominent example of the evidence of the manifestation of extreme physical dysfunction by the attempt of the psyche to protect its mind?
Resignation syndrome?
Yes. Resignation
from work or resignation in despair?
I'm not sure.
No. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. Is the person gone, you say?
Yes.
I think we need
actually, this one isn't gone. Jeffrey Dowd, did you want to talk? Did you want to say what that was?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
yes,
can.
I can.
Okay. So resignation syndrome is a syndrome observed in asylum seekers. It's been noted in the adolescents and the pediatric population of asylum seekers who have been denied harbour in countries such as, I think, Sweden. The cases are found there, as well as the offshore processing facilities of Australia as well, in terms of those refugees. And it's a syndrome in where, upon hearing the news of their non-acceptance of harbour for refugee status, that the children goes into a comatose state in which they basically, well, more or less maintain autonomic function, although even in some cases, they even lose some features of that as well, such as being incontinent. So they're basically in a comatose state, rendered, I believe, well, directly from that psychological stressor event, really. It's something that's rather interesting if you want to read up more about it, but I think it ties in quite nicely with this topic.
Yes, thank you, Jeffrey. I'm vaguely aware of that kind of reaction. But I have no clinical familiarity with it, of course. Though I can say that over the years I've seen children under threat go into sort of deep, unreactive sleep states. I've seen adults under threat recurrently unable to function and unable to be any more than slightly responsive to people, and I've seen that in relation to trauma or in relation to events that kind of signify the possibility of more trauma. So I have no problem accepting that as a plausible explanation.
Thank you. Somebody would like to know if there are any books apart from yours that you recommend to get familiar with these topics.
There is a recent book, and I meant to write it down. If you look up Cause Health, C-A-U-S-E, obviously, Health, H-E-A-L-T-H, I think they use it as one word. It's a Norwegian origin. It's a consortium of clinicians, philosophers, public health people, even mathematicians, and I've been involved too at a distance. And there's just a recent book come out which is open access. And if you like, I could send that URL to you, Nicola, to
yes.
be available.
Okay.
All right, I'll do that.
That's fine.
And you'll find it open access and free, and it has a whole lot of, the first part of it is more philosophical, and the second part is a whole group of diverse clinicians from over the world who are subscribing to the notion that we've got to develop what they call a singularist approach to disease causation. All right, and basically that's what I'm talking about tonight in a different way for them. So I can certainly provide that URL, but if you go to Cause Health and look up Anjum, A-N-J-U-M, Rani Anjum, you'll find references somewhere there to that book. It's a very good entry to a wider view of this than I'm giving you tonight.
Excellent, thank you. Andrew, I think you've got some questions. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes,
there?
thanks very much, Nicola. Brian, could you comment, please, on the value of listening apart from the obvious treatment of somatic illness, which as a clinician you do? And I'm talking in particular about people like psychotherapy therapists or spiritual directors or clinical psychologists or counsellors. Are you can you say anything about that in terms of the value of actually helping people deal with significant issues and maybe even diseases?
I think I alluded to, I mean, I made an entry into this through recognizing connections between or seeing the symbolic representation of stories in parts of the body that seem to reflect the story. So I entered this through meanings. And for a start, I thought everything was about meaning and symbolism. But I don't go looking for symbolism these days. I see it, but I don't go looking for it. I go looking for connections between events and experiences and disease, and I'm going to get to your point in a moment. And what I've realised is that actually healing in this area is relational. And what is a relationship? It is many things, but it involves a mutuality and a mutual listening reality in which one joins with the other in some kind of emergent collaboration. Now, if we don't listen to each other, we don't get the emergent results that we need. And it goes back to a previous question in psychotherapy, for instance, that if you go to psychotherapy with your school of theory and impose that on the reality of the patient, you're not actually listening. You're making them listen. I mean, that's putting it a bit black and white, but in principle. So I think the primary function is to listen to one another, to be sensitive to what we're hearing, to check out whether we're really hearing what we're hearing. And that is the healing arena. I think I've come to the view that it's not so much about facts as it is about the quality of the relationship.
And in addition to that, Brian, can I ask, in terms of as a person is telling their story and you're listening to their story and they are retelling their story, is there a point where in their own relationships they get to a point of forgiveness of self or others? Is that a significant thing? Does that tie into the faith dimension at all?
I think many things happen, Andrew. I think I'm not avoiding your question so much as avoiding your answer. Does it forgiveness? And I mean, forgiveness is one of the hardest things in the world, actually. So it's quite a process for people, and all sorts of things come into resolution of an issue that leads to a sense that no longer do I hold on to it and I forgive. So I think we should hesitate to rush to what it is that does it, and stay with what is. Let me put it in terms of a friend of mine, Tony Suckman, who's a physician in the States, who said to me in a clinic I joined with him many years ago, I always ask myself when I'm listening to a patient, what is trying to happen here? Not what am I trying to make happen here? What should happen here given the time I've got? But what is trying to happen here? And I feel that that's very good advice. It takes us away from our egoistic need to be effective, it deploys trust, it deploys belief in loving relationship. It deploys so many things. And what will be right for one person won't be exactly right for the next person. As I said, each time you see a person, you go into the room naked. don't mean physically, of course. I mean naked in the sense of assumptions about what is going to be the case or should be the case.
The other question I've got here before I go back to Nicola again is you raised the issue of Bob and what Bob believed and what you believed, and this is one of the perennial questions for us in Christians in Science, is that what do you, Brian, do about Bob and what he believes, and what does Bob do about you? I mean, how can we wrestle with this very, very difficult issue of unbelieving each other, or him unbelieving you, for example?
All I can do is tell another story there, Andrew, and that is that when I started the mind-body healthcare program at AUT, we made it multidisciplinary, and the initial course we had some 17 or 18 students, and they came from all kinds of discipline. And of course we wrestled with sort of disciplinary language and so on. But what actually happened between these highly different people was when they started to listen properly to one another, they started to share, or we all started to share, our common humanity, our common need for connectedness, our common relationality, our common desires for finding our way forward. I became more and more aware that we start off from fixed positions, and we will only get close to people if we can see they're going to be accepting of what we are. But accepting what we are also means that we have to be accepting of them and willing to not discard our origins, our journeys, our trajectories, but to discover that actually there's far more to be found in loving one another than there is to be found in arguing with one another. And the only way to do that is to get together and talk properly, and develop an intimacy, a relational intimacy that will trump all these things, in my experience. And we found that when we allowed that to happen, it became a lovely transitional space for so many people. A lot of people gave up their favoured, not gave up, but they relinquished the black and whiteness of their favoured positions. And I think that's what I meant by reductionism in my earlier comments, that reductionism leads to a kind of cold black and white places.
Mm. Okay, I'm aware it's almost 9 o'clock, but there are just two questions I'll just pass by you, Neil. Brian.
Right.
Brian. This one says, this person's clients sometimes deny they have any emotional issues, some vehemently so. What do you do with patients like that?
That's a huge question. I don't know how to simplify it, except that when a person denies having any emotional issues, one can assume that that's defensive, in my experience. It's not possible to be in the world and not have both negative and positive emotions, for instance. It's not possible to be in the world without having some difficulties. Of course, some people positivize things and erase and exclude negativity, and to some extent that's healthy. To a certain extent, that is obviously healthy, but mostly it's, in the extreme cases, is defensive. A lot of people who have no emotional issues do present with physical symptoms and illnesses. Where do you go with emotional issues if you can't talk, you can't recognize feelings, you can't share feelings, you can't talk to people about who you are? Where do you go? Many people go towards medicine. They go, they get treatment for physical disorders. Now, I'm not saying that all physical disorders reflect that kind of personality, but the question was asked, and that's a quick answer. There are some patients with so-called alexithymia, and they're uncommon, but they can't recognize any feeling, even hunger. So we are all on a spectrum of ability to experience and name feelings, and those of you or us who've been fortunate enough to have parents that reflect and mirror feelings and allow the child to feel them and name them and so on, will be better fitted for the future than those in whom feelings are suppressed or not acceptable. But look, if you want to look at those sorts of questions, my books deal with a lot of that.
Well, now the last question is, I think, also not answerable, but I'll ask it anyway. This is a question about contemporary interpretations of scripture verses that refer to healing, please.
Is that the question?
That's the question, yes.
I can clarify if you like.
Okay. Yep.
I'm thinking particularly about John 15:7, where you find Jesus saying, "If you remain in me and my words remain in you, you shall ask for whatever you want in my name, and it shall be given to you." I've just gone and looked up that verse, and there's 18 different interpretations according to what particular type of scripture you're referring to. But the general idea is there that people in need, say in need of a healing, even in contemporary society, they'll refer to prayer for healing. I'm just want to get your thoughts on what meaning that verse should have in contemporary healthcare, and what hope people can place in it, and what expectations they should have for healing.
Well, I'll talk from my experience. When we started the Arahura Centre in Christchurch, that was a place where many Christians came for counselling, or were referred for counselling by their pastors. What we found was interesting, that people who were adamant that they were just going to believe and pray harder often struggled more than people who accepted their stories and their whatever sense of responsibility or whatever emerged out of that story and what they needed to do. I think there was in those kinds of people, there was a desire to bypass the relational realities in their lives, bypass the trauma, bypass what needed to be done. So actually, those Christians did worse in our experience than did non-Christians. And that was an impression that we had about, I don't know, at one stage about 18 staff at the centre, medical and non-medical, psychotherapists, counsellors and so on. That was a common experience. On the other hand, when we had Christians in who were open to doing their own work and who were supported in their own church groups or in prayer groups and so on, those people often did very well, was our impression. So they were benefiting from whatever came from taking responsibility for what they needed to do, and whatever came from being in a group with other Christians and whatever that implied. So I think making a verse like that into a reductionist formula for human divine experience and healing is pretty risky from my perspective.
Right, thank you. So great questions, everybody. I think we're going to end here. So over to Andrew.
I just want to express our collective and individual thanks to you for quite a wonderful presentation. There are still nearly 60 participants here, and there were 100 that heard your talk, which was wonderful. I first read your book, Somatic Illness and the Patient's Other Story, and was really taken by the story of the woman with the florid facial rash who put on a brave face due to past trauma. And that connection that you've drawn together again tonight with so many stories between the body, the mind and the spirit, and the unity of those parts of it, I think is incredibly important in terms of both our understanding of ourselves and understanding disease and understanding our world, and about COVID as well. You've emphasised our connectedness with others and above all the relationships we're in, but you're encouraging us to wait for the echoes of the story, and that you go listening to what they say, that you do actually alongside take a longitudinal history. I think are things that should be ringing in our ears going forward. And I loved your advice to the young medical doctor that what they should do is learn how to listen and listen and listen and listen again, and not fix anything quickly. And then, of course, if there's problems, you tell another story. So thank you so much for your presentation. It will be online. We have recorded it, and it will be on the New Zealand Christians in Science website in a couple of days. And Nicola's just going to remind us of when our next session is. Thank you so much, everyone, for being a part, and especially you, Brian, for your presentation.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, everybody. The next lecture will be October the 14th in person in Auckland, if COVID levels allow. So thank you so much to everybody for coming tonight, and especially to you, Brian.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.